I too am completely convinced that we are living in the noosphere and don't yet know it quite. And of course, everyone knows that the term nous from Greek refers to mind. What we're talking about, of course, is something like mind, but we're not sure what it is yet. And since I'm going to be talking a little bit about what you might call the science of the noosphere, such a science does not yet exist, but we have good pieces of it, and many of those pieces are represented in this room. And so in part what I want to do is expand on that idea. In doing so, it'll be a shift. Since my presentation is not about disseminating this idea and making it attractive to people, but to say something about the scientific side of the problem. And hopefully you'll hear more about that as we move along. It's perhaps a little more pedantic, I hope not too. But let me begin by talking about, how I got to become involved in this. My history, of course, goes back considerably farther than this, but my interest in Teilhard's work began mostly with a feeling that he was wrong. Back in the 1970s, when I first came across this idea, I thought, this is not very scientific. This is very much a theological, speculative, almost science fiction-y kind of view. In the generations since then, my work has sort of convinced me from my own work that it probably has a lot to tell us. And so I'll try to give you more of an autobiographical view of how I've come to that perspective. But this gives you a sense that Ben and I have been talking about this, and Brian and I have been talking about this for a considerable period of time, and I consider this a remarkable fulfillment of those discussions and the development of the Human Energy Project itself. And you can see that one of the very first steps in this process that I was involved in was because I was the president of a group called the International Society for the Study of Information. I was able to put on a conference here in Berkeley in which, thanks to Ben's assistance, we brought many interesting speakers in, including Francis, who was one of our major speakers on the topic. And that led to a workshop held here at St. Mary's roughly about 6-8 months later. I can't remember exactly how much. But basically it says that I've been involved in this project from its sort of brainstorming stage to this remarkable, I think, first step. And the first step is us getting to know each other and developing our own, you might say, small noosphere. Just to give you a sense of my background, I won't go into a lot of the details. You're certainly welcome to ask me about this, but all of my career I've been interested in human evolution, and that interest has been played out mostly in studying the evolution of the brain, using a variety of anatomical and molecular techniques, and also looking at how brains develop, because I'm convinced from my own work that you can't understand evolution unless you also understand how bodies develop. Development is, I think, has really changed things. We now have a field that's sometimes called EVO, which is putting together evolution and development, because they're really part of a very much more complex process. I studied this for many years using a technique called neural transplantation, where we took literally neurons from one animal's brain and put them into another animal's brain, in part because it allowed us to see both species differences and species commonalities as to how brains developed, whether neurons from one species could talk to neurons in another species. We actually developed this into technologies that have been used in human procedures. In fact, some of my earlier work was associated with using cell transplant techniques with respect to Parkinson's disease, for example. But my work has been driven all along by this sort of larger sense that there's something unusual about human evolution, and it has mostly to do with the development of language. And so a lot of my interest is to try to explain what's happened to change the brain of a primate, a typical primate, into a brain that can do what you and I are doing right now. And this has led me also to a much broader set of questions as I sort of move out here. Questions about what's the very nature of information, the very nature of meaning, the very nature of what sometimes is called a semiotic process, a process of sharing information in the broadest possible sense. So this sort of is the motivation for why I became involved with human energy. And as I said before, most of my work has been laboratory-based and theoretical in some respects. But as I got to know this project, and Ben and I can't exactly remember how we originally were introduced, I think by another friend of mine named Jeremy Sherman, who introduced us, I realized that there was a real synergy in these ideas, even though I came from a very different background with very different interests. And so my 40-year career in this area has really sort of brought me in this direction. That is, to study the evolution and development of brains, human evolution, and the origins of language, and the nature of these semiotic processes. Basically, it opens up a question about the mystery of this final transition that we've been talking about, the transition to us. Why we're unusual in the world, why we're a very unusual species. And as Brian mentioned before, one of the phrases I used in one of my earlier books is that genetically we're just another African ape, but cognitively we're like a whole new phylum of organisms. And so the surprising thing is how a tiny little biological tweak could have produced such an unusual transition in evolution. That the emergence of some very new way that evolution can take place. And that's really the critical question of the noosphere, of course. And what I want to say today is that, in fact, all of these things that were of critical interest to my research career turn out to also be critical to understanding this concept of the noosphere. So it's not a surprise that I became interested in this. Not a surprise that I became attracted to this, despite my you might say, more empirical focus. It's exploded in my mind as the most important thing I could probably end up doing for the rest of my career. Because in part, what I want to say is that the noosphere isn't in the future. And this, I echo what you said, Gregory, just very clearly, we're in the middle of it. It's something that's happening now. This is a transition that's taking place now, and we need to be aware of it and involved in it. So what I want to do is to also get a sense of how some of the work that I've done more recently since the mid-90s really fills in this area. These are 3 books, 2 that have been published and 1 that's about to come out. The first one I wrote in the mid-1990s, a summary of a lot of my work on the evolution of the brain, how brains have changed, the anatomy, and the evolution of this process, and what made language possible and what makes language unusual to the kind of communication that other species are engaged in. And so as a result, this is an argument about how symbolic communication, this is why I call it the symbolic species, how symbolic communication actually modified the human brain. This is an argument that doesn't suggest that some accident happened and suddenly we're able to do this. Literally what we are doing now has played a role over the course of possibly as much as 2 million years, modifying the human brain. And part of my work was to demonstrate and to identify what's changed in the human brain. Remarkably little, it turns out. Yes, our brains are bigger, but that's a very small part of the story. The second book, which I wrote in the middle of this last century, that is now 10 years ago, Incomplete Nature. It was actually a development. I consider it a sort of prequel to my first book. And I was very much interested in also a process that was critical to what we've been talking about today. And that is how what you might call meaningful or purposeful processes, end-directed processes, can emerge in the physical world. Because chemistry and physics is not normative. There's not good or bad chemistry. There's not good or bad transitions or changes in the physical world until you get to living things. Suddenly there are good and bad chemistry because of us. There is right and wrong representations. There is helpful and harmful things. These are processes that emerged in the physical world. And yet, the natural sciences basically exclude any discussion of what we call normative, or you might say evaluative relationships. And yet they clearly have emerged in the world. That means that they're part of the physical world, and we need a physical explanation for this. We need an explanation of the natural sciences that makes it not absurd that we exist. Natural sciences have to be expanded in this sense, and we've been talking in this way today. Finally, in fact, with some support from Ben even, during a sabbatical, a year that I took, I've been working on another book that's now titled Falling Up, Inverse Darwinism and Life's Complexity Ratchet. You can ask me later on what I mean by inverse Darwinism. I came from a very standard Darwinian training back in Harvard, working with some of the brightest minds in this area, battling over some of the theory and so on. This is not anti-Darwinism. Darwinism is got to be expanded for us to understand how these processes work. So what I'm after in this book, and by studying mostly at the level of neurons, molecules, genes, proteins, and so on, we've begun to realize, and I'm not alone in this, that there's a very different kind of process, like the Darwinian process, going on, you might say, at the level of cells, at the level of molecules, that actually inverts some of the logic of Darwin's theory. And the nice thing is that inversion is a perfect complement. It is what actually makes Darwinism possible. You need to have both a selective, subtractive aspect, which Darwin, following Malthus, began to think might be a critical part of the story. But you also need something that introduces complexity, introduces synergistic relationships. We've, I think, up until the very recent time, because we did not have some of these tools at the molecular level in particular, we have not actually had the tools to see what was going on. And so we've talked about it as chance, we've talked about it as mutation, we've talked about it as Lamarckian-like stories, because we only had these very high-level understanding of it. Now I think we have tools to do this. And these tools turn out to be critical to understanding the problems that we're now facing. So let me go back and talk to you about how I think these three steps have led me to this perspective. Because it's what Teilhard describes as an inflection point in evolution. A point at which evolution that was diversifying and diversifying suddenly reaches a point where there can be new convergence. Where instead of getting more and more separate, things become more and more integrated. And for me, as my 1997 book, The Symbolic Species, suggested, it had to do with a unique way that human beings think and communicate. We use the word symbol, and unfortunately, it's a very promiscuous term, and as a result, I think we don't fully understand what we mean by it. But my claim in that book was that human cognition is unique because of the use of symbolic thought and communication, and in particular, language. But the point is that this is not just increased intelligence. It's not having more stuff going on faster or more combinations. It's actually a fairly discontinuous way that we can refer to things in the world. We know this in part by virtue of the fact that the words we're using, and I'm using right now, don't connect with anything out here. There's no physical likeness of the words. There's no connection with something happening immediately. We have developed a way of communicating that is, to some extent, displaced from the world. But because of that, it means that media no longer are limited. The ways we communicate are no longer limited by what's immediately in front of us. As a result, we can know about the incredible size of the universe. We can know about the incredibly tiny activities taking place at the nuclear level or within our cells, things that we cannot have an experience of directly. But we can penetrate precisely because of this displacement of this way of communicating and thinking. But we're also unique in part because our brains have adapted to the niche, this symbolic niche that's out there. For some period of time, and I think looking at brain evolution and the new knowledge we have about the genetics of these processes, this has probably been going on for almost 2 million years. That means our ways of thinking have diverged from the ways that other species think. Our ways of communicating have diverged, but also to the extent that we almost can't help ourselves but think this way. I sometimes like to describe us as symbolic savants. That is, we're so tied into this way of thinking that it's totally natural. That we think that this is the way the world works. And in fact, we're surprised to find out that other animals don't do this. But the important part about this adaptation, we've adapted to this new kind of niche. But this is not a physical niche. This is not a niche made up of plants and animals, rocks and clouds and so on. This is a niche made up of symbols, which are themselves, to some extent, disconnected from the world, and yet have given us this incredible penetrated view. The other aspect of this, though, that I think is critical to what we've been talking about, is that because of the referential flexibility that symbolic communication provides us, we alone are able to share the contents of our memories and thoughts with each other. A recent colleague of mine came back from the field studying chimpanzees and was telling me about this case in which one chimpanzee from one troop moves into another troop and is very agitated and so on, has no way to communicate what just happened. As we were just hearing, to some extent, other species are islands. Their cognitive experience can be shared maybe superficially, maybe emotionally, but the details are gone. The memories and thoughts are not there. But in this respect, we have an unprecedented capacity to use this new way of communicating, of thinking, to actually produce collective thought processes and mutual intentionality, and to get inside of each other's heads. In fact, we spend an inordinate amount of time in each other's thoughts, worried about what each others are thinking, trying to suggest something is. So in this respect, this is something that's called intersubjectivity. That is, we live in a world that is not just me. We live in a world that's all of you. Maybe in little bits and pieces here and there, but it also is a world that includes people that I've met, people that have influenced me, my grandparents, and my desire to communicate to generations not yet born. In this respect, what we mean by a human mind is intrinsically interpenetrated with other human minds. This is what I mean by saying that we're already in the noosphere. The noosphere is about this interconnection of mental processes made possible by this unique discovery, symbolic communication. So in this respect, we have minds, we have brains that I think are intrinsically noospheric. It's not a surprise that this is coming about. Symbolic information cannot be acquired or transmitted genetically. That is, we don't have any innate words. But we have to learn it, and we have to learn it by being embedded in a culture, being embedded in a symbolic niche. And we've been evolving in this niche for a long period of time, and it's played a role in stabilizing the groups that we have. In fact, the very fact that we're sitting here like this, and you guys are listening to somebody ramble on, if this was a chimpanzee troop, this room would be torn apart. We are doing remarkable things because of this capacity, something that has never occurred in evolution before. And what this tells us is that the very notion of a human mind is dependent upon being embedded within this local symbolic ecosystem. Now, I think, as I said, I think this has been going on for a long period of time, and I think you've heard that from us multiple times now. This is not just a science fiction future. This is not just about right now. This is about the whole of, I think, human history and human prehistory. So I like to call the groups that we've been in, we sometimes call them cultures or societies, I think we can think of them as noos deems. Deem refers to a collective group, a group of species, a group of animals that's maybe a subspecies or a local population. In order to even think, we human beings have to be embedded in one of these noos deems, a mental group that shares all of these interpretive habits. And in this sense, I like to think of ourselves as what I call obligate symbionts. A symbiont, of course, is a creature that is inside of another creature. Endosymbiont means an organism that depends on you. Now, we have many bacterial organisms that depend on us, that we carry around with us. Aphids carry little microbes in their guts, in which their guts have been adapted to maintain these aphid microbes. And these are used to penetrate into the surfaces of plants so that aphids can actually eat. If they didn't have these symbionts, they couldn't do it. A lot of organisms we now understand are the result of organisms within organisms within organisms at various levels. What I mean by an obligate symbiont is that you can't do without it. There are many species that if they lost this microorganism in their body, termites are a good example. Termites can digest cellulose because they carry endosymbionts. But they are now obligate. And the obligation goes in two directions. The symbionts couldn't exist without their host, and the host couldn't exist without their symbionts. We are, in this sense, endosymbionts in the noosphere. We can't exist without it, and it doesn't exist without us. In this respect, we're what I call inseparably entangled with each other. We're part of this larger mentality. But the issue is that over the course of human prehistory and current history, these small little noos deems, as I like to call them, have been merging together, have been linking up, getting larger and larger. And in this process, we've also expanded the noosphere. So it's no longer just the people I'm aware of and interacting with, but it involves also information from the past. Today, I consider a lot of my thoughts influenced by Greeks living 3,000 years ago. Their thoughts are in my thoughts. Our noosphere has expanded not just in space, but also across time. And of course, into the future to some extent. Obviously, this has been aided by taking our symbolic capacities and then offloading them again and again into more interesting and more displaced media, like writing, mathematics, musical notation, print, and of course, currently, all these electronic media that are really expanding the process, speeding it up, making it simpler, as we've been talking about. I think our current era, the reason that we're beginning to focus on this and why it's such an interesting topic is that with the advent of computer-augmented communication, IT and AI, for example, there is both a vastly greater potential for global mutual intentionality, but also a greater tendency to seed the mental work that we maybe should be involved in, to these mechanical prostheses that are out there. Think about your cell phone. 10 years ago, you had to remember all of the phone numbers of the people you know. How many remember those phone numbers now? What's happened as we offload function, we also have to give up function. But that means we become more and more obligate symbionts. We cannot allow this system to collapse now because it's what we are. So this is a major evolutionary transition. But like so many true evolutionary transitions, it probably takes a very, very long time, hundreds of thousands of years potentially. You've heard about some of these in the last presentation, so I won't wander through any of them. what happens, of course, is what at one point in time were autonomous units, maybe in cells that could survive on their own, now cooperate to make a larger unit. But in that process, they give up some of their autonomy. The cells in my body no longer can survive outside of a body. Their autonomy has been given up. One of the things that we struggle with in envisioning the future of this process is to what kind of autonomy are we giving up? I want to be clear that we've already given up massive autonomy, precisely because we're inside this noosphere. The question is, can we do the science? Are we in time to do the science, to understand how it works? Because if you don't understand something and you begin to manipulate it and try to fix it, typically you do it wrong. You make mistakes. You got to have good science behind you to do it right. We're just beginning to do this. I want to shift now to ask the question, why is development of this science so critical right now? Well, we all know why, but here's a good picture of it. Ben mentioned these sort of hockey stick-like trends. It's across almost every aspect of human society, human technology, human civilization. But it's also not just an economic and social feature. It's something that's happening to the Earth system itself. We certainly know this in terms of the global climate change. I won't go into all this list. But what it basically says is that something is happening right now. An incredible acceleration. It's sometimes been called the Great Acceleration, or in a sense, the acceleration driven by what's sometimes called the Anthropocene. That is that period in time in which humans have left a mark on the Earth that is global. This is happening now at an incredible rate. But here's the problem. As the Club of Rome back in 72 suggested, it can't go on forever. In fact, what we know about living processes, wherever they occur, is that if they go through an exponential growth phase, they eventually run out of steam. They use up all their resources. They dump too much waste too fast into the world. This is a very simplified diagram in which I talk about what I call global or collective entropy. Entropy is that heat that's given off, that wasted heat that's given off when any work is done. You might think of it as the increase of mass or the increase of waste. If you put it all together, one of the things that we've done is that we have generated so much structure in the world that we call civilization. In part, in that process, we've had to produce a lot of entropy. That's the heat of the world and the waste of the world that we're dumping out there. The problem is we're going to run out of resources for this energy very, very fast, and we're going to use up the space that we're in. So the key is that this is not sustainable. We know we can't do this forever, but we don't know how to undo the process. We're addicted to it, in part because of being part of a noosphere. The key is that this demands effectively a global level of intentionality, true noospheric intentionality. Without it, we're going to take the downward spiral. I'm hoping that we move from an Anthropocene to what I've just called here a Noocene, a period in the history of the Earth in which now there is a global level of cognition controlling the Earth system that includes us. So what is the science of the noosphere? What should it provide us? I hope I've given you a sense of what the problems are and why we're where we are and what we may need to understand. To do this, we're going to need to bring together insights from lots of different fields. I've listed a few here. Evolutionary biology, neuroscience, information science, and anthropology. But of course, probably many other fields as well. And we have to analyze how this process is taking place. It is taking place. It's happening right now. We need to know how it works. What are the levers that might be available to us to tweak it here and there? We need to use this to identify and study these conditions. And we need to understand the processes. that have contributed to this. Because if we don't, it's spontaneously going to go in another direction that we may not be happy with. Therefore, we need to anticipate how the evolution of the noosphere might develop in directions that are not conducive to human flourishing. This is why people are worried that we're going to become like ant colonies in the future, like the Star Trek Borg, in which all these minds are just part of a single mind absorbed into a global mind. Doesn't seem to be a very attractive future, a dystopia. We don't want to go in that direction, but we need to understand the processes that are moving, because that's the direction that every superorganism process that has existed before us has gone. Ant colonies, termite colonies, beehives. This is where they've gone. This is that offloading of autonomy, where the workers are willing to sacrifice themselves for the whole. Where, in a sense, the autonomy of individuals is gone. We appreciate and love that autonomy, but we also love being part of this larger whole. Part of the question is, where is it going to go? So we need to understand how to promote these conditions to help maximize a positive direction. And this is what makes it even more interesting, because it's a direction that evolution has not taken.